What it do, anime crew? Hey man, listen, today I just watched Jackals and Fireflies, which is a 20-minute short film you can find on YouTube by Charlie Kaufman. I'm not very familiar with Kaufman's catalog, but this was actually a video that was suggested to me by a friend of mine, and I know that he is a very big fan of Kaufman's work and has implied heavily to me that there is a super distinct visual cinematic style to his work, and so this was my first ever exposure to that. Seems very, very cool. This was something that, honestly, it almost made me cry. And I don't have a very good reason for that. It's an extremely atmospheric, vibes-oriented sort of short film, sort of like by design, even thematically so. It starts off with a bunch of these shots of, like, a bunch of different reflections of the character. Only part of the screen is illuminated, with the rest usually being, like, dark and just showing like the side of a building or the side of a room or glass or something like that. And then just a small part of the screen is illuminated, and it shows like a reflection that's like not even head on of the main character. And it really establishes not only a good sense of setting with all of the objects in the foreground, but also a sense of sort of the perspective that this story takes. It's a story that emphasizes her sense of insignificance, as communicated by it only taking up a small portion of the shot. And in that same vein, it is a story about how the world around her reflects her own thoughts and identity and shapes her. It's a very, very beautiful, contemplative story as you witness this girl who is clearly an extremely thoughtful, eloquent person who cares deeply about being able to express her feelings, as she essentially just describes being so out of control of your experiences and your thoughts as you just make your way through life. How one thing just sort of bounces to another, they're unrelated. At one second it's your thought, and then in the next second you're just observing somebody else's conversation, and it just kind of ebbs and flows. This is something of like a meditative piece, only in tone. And I think that's interesting because one of the things that I always hear about meditation and like what you realize when you start doing meditation is that you realize your thoughts are not in your control. You are not the origin of your thoughts. They merely pass by you and you choose what to do with them. I think that's kind of an idea that this short film was definitely exploring here, as she was sort of just walking around town, experiencing these things, not necessarily choosing what she listens in on, not necessarily choosing how she feels about these things, but just experiencing them and saying them in an incredibly frank, matter-of-fact way, not necessarily trying to ascribe any value to them or anything like that. She mentioned several times the idea of your body merely being a vessel out of your control. Your body is a cab or a taxi that you fail to hail every day. It passes by. It is basically all to say that there is no sense of control over your thoughts. There is no sense of control over your feelings and what you think as you just sort of go through life. It's a very lonely and somewhat overly contemplative tone, I would say. Not in a bad way, but just in the sense that it's contemplative to the point where it's a bit depressing. And I think that's definitely by design. She's a person who the entire time is kind of just talking to herself. It gets pretty meta at points where she like zooms out and you see the whole camera and everything. And she's just taking in so much information. Some of it seems like it makes sense. Some of it's dressed up real pretty. Some of it's said real frank. And it's just so much shit to sift through. The sheer volume of noise in this world, just informational noise that there is overwhelming. And, it kind of ends up getting drowned out and feeling a bit insignificant. It feels exactly how I have felt in the past alone with thoughts. There's this terrible quote. I mean, no, it's a good quote, but I've just heard it parroted by a lot of people to the point where I sort of reflexively view it as cringe because I associate it with those people, which is a really pretentious mindset. But a man who only thinks has nothing to think about but thought itself. Essentially, if you are never going out and doing things, you're just sitting inside and thinking, you are going to run out of things to think about and just start thinking on top of thinking, on top of thinking, on top of thinking. And while this girl is certainly going out and doing things, she seems constantly in touch with observing and recounting everything that's happened. She is not leaving her mind. She is being, actually in some ways, extremely mindful and tracking all of her thoughts, all the feelings that she's had, everything that happened as she went through the day. But in a lot of ways, even though sometimes things are seen as a little bit beautiful and sometimes they're seen as a little bit bleak, she is sort of merely an observer. As going back to what she was saying about the body and it passing you by like a cab, this is very strongly from the perspective of an observer. I remember there's one time where it's implied that she might be some sort of therapist or something when she says she considered offering her services but decided against it. It's like she wasn't, for whatever reason, she wasn't ready to intervene. And while, that just makes sense in a normal interaction, I think the reason that they included that scene and gave it a bit of a emphasis with where the music was at was because that was a little bit of an important character moment, in my opinion. I don't know. I'm just talking out of my ass, to be honest. But I really liked that part. And I like the idea of just being there alone in your own head, poetically describing everything you've seen, and at times just merely giving up, not being able to totally give in to the moment and let yourself go and free yourself of these thoughts. It's a little too close to home, you know what I mean. Pretty fucking close to home. It's yeah.